If I told you that building massive 3D printed underground military bunkers and rewriting the rules for how we buy semiconductors are actually two sides of the exact same strategy. Wait, scratch that. If I told you they were the exact same thing, would you believe me?
I mean, on paper, it sounds completely unrelated.
Right. But today, we are looking at how India is actually wiring its future. We're taking a massive stack of recent sources spanning strategic military doctrines, international trade, major Supreme Court rulings, and economic data, and we're finding the connective tissue between them.
Yeah, because a nation is, well, it's an incredibly dynamic, interwoven ecosystem.
Exactly. And we've structured this custom-tailored deep dive specifically for you, the learner. We're keeping the analytical rigor of a competitive exam aspirant, like, say, a UPSC candidate, firmly in mind. We're just going to list what's happening. We're going to break down why it's happening and how the underlying mechanisms actually work. Okay, let's unpack this.
Perfect. Because, you really can't understand one piece without understanding how it turns the gears of the others. A shift in border security doctrine ripples right through to domestic trade, which impacts economic policy, which ultimately shapes the constitutional rights of the individual citizen.
So let's start at the outermost layer of those gears, which is national security. It has officially been 1 year since Operation Sindoor.
Has it been a year already? Wow.
Yeah, exactly 1 year.
Yeah.
And our sources show this fascinating shift in military doctrine over this past year. The armed forces are heavily focused on large-scale underground infrastructure now.
Right.
We're talking about massive command and control centers equipped with C4I2SR systems, alongside these rapidly deployable 3D printed bunkers.
But I have to ask why. I mean, is this an admission that future conflicts are just going to be drawn out World War I style wars of attrition, just fought underground?
No, actually, it's the exact opposite of trench warfare attrition. This infrastructure push is a direct recognition of modern multi-domain warfare.
How so? Well, conflicts today target a nation's digital nervous system and its decision-making nodes first. So those C4I2SR systems you mentioned, which is command, control, communications, computers, intelligence, information, surveillance, and reconnaissance.
That is a mouthful.
It really is. But basically, they require immense server capability and constant connectivity. By hardening these assets deep underground, you ensure operational continuity. You aren't just hiding soldiers, right? You are protecting the military's actual brain from sudden precision hypersonic strike.
Oh, I see. And above ground, they're rolling out advanced air defense, right?
Yeah.
Heavily integrating the Akash Teer system. From what I understand, Akash Teer is this automated air defense control and reporting system that digitizes the entire airspace.
Yeah, it prioritizes threats so that S-400 batteries can intercept them hundreds of kilometers away. That integration is vital. And it all ties back to the strategic lessons of Operation Sindoor. The editorial by Syed Ada Hasnain in our source stack frames this perfectly. He calls it a masterclass in the doctrine of, and I quote, calibrated force under a nuclear overhang.
I was actually reading Hasnain's piece, and he brings up this stability-instability paradox. And to me, that always sounded incredibly counterintuitive.
How do you mean?
Well, it's like two people standing in a room full of gasoline, right?
Yeah.
Both are holding lit matches. Neither wants to drop their match and blow up the whole room, so they end up just kicking each other in the shins, knowing the other person won't risk full annihilation over a bruised leg. I mean, does having nuclear weapons actually make low-level proxy wars more likely?
That analogy actually hits a nail on the head. For decades, the umbrella of mutually assured destruction created stability at the highest level.
Meaning no full-blown conventional war.
Exactly, but it created deep instability at the lower levels, which allowed state-sponsored proxy terrorism to flourish. What Hasnain argues is that Operation Sindoor bypassed that paradox.
Right, by executing a highly calibrated subconventional strike.
Yes. India proved it could eliminate a threat without crossing the opponent's nuclear threshold. It forced the adversary into a gray zone where neither their usual proxy tactics nor a full conventional escalation were viable options.
So you establish a very clear red line, and then you build the underground and aerial infrastructure to ensure you can take a hit if things escalate.
Precisely.
And that posture isn't just happening on our physical land borders. It's translating directly into our maritime diplomacy.
Let's look at Southeast Asia for a second. India and Vietnam have just elevated their ties to an enhanced comprehensive strategic partnership.
This is a major diplomatic lever. As part of this, Vietnam officially joined the Indo-Pacific Oceans Initiative, or IPOI. Crucially, both nations released statements heavily emphasizing adherence to UNCLS.
The UN Convention on the Law of the Sea.
Right, specifically regarding the South China Sea. which is a very pointed signal regarding freedom of navigation in a highly contested, heavily militarized region. But they aren't just talking about security patrols, are they? They set a bilateral trade goal of $25 billion by 2030.
Because maritime security and economic security are indistinguishable at this level. If we connect this to the bigger picture, the Vietnam Partnership is a cornerstone of India's broader relationship with the ASEAN bloc.
And right now, India and ASEAN are in the midst of renegotiating their major trade agreement, AITIGA, the ASEAN-India Trade and Goods Agreement.
Right, and they have a strict target to conclude this by the end of the year.
And the data shows exactly why there's such an urgent rush to renegotiate. India's trade deficit with the ASEAN region has just absolutely ballooned. I mean, we went from an $8 billion deficit in financial year 2013 to a staggering $45 billion deficit in financial year 2025.
Yeah, that's a massive jump.
What is the mechanism behind that spike? Did we just suddenly start buying $45 billion more in raw materials from Southeast Asia?
No, not exactly. The underlying mechanism here is something called rules of origin, and it actually ties back to a completely different trade bloc. The Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, or RCEP.
Oh, right. India famously opted out of RCEP to protect its domestic manufacturing since it's heavily influenced by China.
Exactly. However, because ASEAN nations are in RCEP, Chinese goods have been entering ASEAN countries, undergoing very minimal value addition, sometimes just repackaging, honestly, and then entering India tariff-free under the existing AITIGA framework.
So the current free trade agreement essentially became a backdoor for the exact imports we were trying to block.
Precisely. The renegotiation of AITIGA is fundamentally about tightening those rules of origin. India needs to ensure that goods claiming tariff exemptions are genuinely manufactured in ASEAN nations. It creates a level playing field so Indian domestic industries aren't just undercut by routed imports.
Which really highlights a brutal truth about geopolitics. You cannot secure trade routes or assert dominance in the Indo-Pacific if your domestic manufacturing engine is just being hollowed out at home.
No, you can't.
Economic self-reliance is the actual bedrock of national security.
Right.
Here's where it gets really interesting. This is the exact philosophy driving the India Semiconductor Mission, or ISM.
Yes.
The cabinet recently approved 2 new semiconductor plants, bringing the total number of facilities under ISM 1.0 up to 12.
Yeah.
Let's dig into the specifics of those approvals, because one of them is a massive leap up the value chain.
You're talking about the Crystal Matrix facility.
Exactly. They are setting up a 3,068 crore rupee facility in Gujarat. And this will be India's very first compound semiconductor display fab, specifically manufacturing mini and micro LED display modules. Up until now, the display fab industry has been almost an exclusive monopoly, held by places like, Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan.
And breaking that monopoly is critical, and it's important to understand what a compound semiconductor actually is.
Right. How is it different from normal chips?
Well, unlike traditional silicon chips, compound semiconductors use materials like gallium nitride or silicon carbide. They can handle much higher power levels and frequencies, and they emit light far more efficiently.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, which is exactly why they are essential for the next generation of micro-LED screens, electric vehicles, and even advanced radar systems.
So we were finally building the actual core components rather than just importing the screens and, screwing them onto laptops and local assembly factories.
Exactly. And this sets the stage for ISM 2.0.
Right. The sources note that while Phase 1 was about attracting the heavy fabrication infrastructure, Phase 2 will pivot to the ecosystem. We're talking about incentivizing the specialized high-purity gases, the chemical precursors, and the actual intellectual property and design of the chips.
Yeah, it's the difference between just buying a car factory and building the entire supply chain that feeds that factory.
But establishing these futuristic industries, that takes years, right?
Yeah. Decades sometimes. And in the meantime, the state has to protect the businesses operating right now from collapsing under immediate global pressures. That is the actual mechanism behind the newly launched Emergency Credit Line Guarantee Scheme 5.0, or ECLGS 5.0.
Okay, let's look at that. This scheme is injecting 2.55 lakh crore rupees in liquidity back into the market, and it's heavily targeted. MSMEs, micro, small, and medium enterprises are getting a 1-year moratorium.
Right.
The airline sector is getting up to 1,500 crore rupees with a 2-year moratorium. But I have to push back here. How does a moratorium actually save an MSME? The business is failing. Are we just kicking the can down the road and letting them accumulate more debt?
That's a super common misconception, actually, but it misunderstands the nature of liquidity shocks.
Okay.
Think about the ongoing conflicts in West Asia. When those supply chains fracture, the cost of raw inputs and freight spikes overnight. An MSME might have a perfectly viable, profitable business model, but they suddenly don't have the cash on hand to pay this month's skyrocketing input costs while waiting for their buyers to pay them.
Oh, I see.
If they default, the business collapses, the workers are fired, and the banks take a loss.
It's a cascading failure.
Exactly. A moratorium stops that cascade. By pausing principal repayment for 1 year, the government gives that MSME the breathing room to adjust their pricing models, negotiate new supplier contracts, and just absorb the geopolitical shock without going bankrupt in the short term.
And the airlines get 2 years simply because aviation turbine fuel prices are exceptionally volatile and take longer to stabilize.
Right. It's basically an economic shock absorber.
But fueling this massive industrial engine, whether it's manufacturing semiconductors or running millions of MSMEs, has a literal exhaust.
It does.
Let's look at this really eye-opening study published in the Nature journal by researchers at IIT Delhi. They investigated the impact of sulfur dioxide, or SO2, emissions from coal-fired power plants across India.
And the findings present a pretty stark reality. The study calculates that fully mitigating SO2 emissions from these coal plants could prevent an estimated 1,024,564 deaths annually.
Over 124,000 lives. Every single year. I mean, if the technology exists to prevent this, why are we seeing India's SO2 emissions rise by nearly 30% in 2023, even as global averages are actually declining?
Well, the technology absolutely exists. It's called flue gas desulfurization, or FGD.
FGD, right.
Yeah. These systems act like massive chemical scrubbers attached to the smokestacks. They spray reagents like limestone slurry into the exhaust gas to bind with the sulfur and remove it before it even hits the atmosphere.
That sounds incredibly effective.
It is. The problem is just the sheer capital expenditure. Installing FGD systems across older coal plants requires billions of dollars.
And the sources show that compliance norms demanding these scrubbers were introduced way back in 2015, but the deadlines just keep getting pushed back.
Yeah. The argument often made by the power sector is that enforcing immediate compliance would force them to hike electricity tariffs, which would then ripple through the economy, making manufacturing more expensive and increasing inflation. However, the IIT Delhi researchers argue that this is a deeply flawed macroeconomic equation.
It's like refusing to fix a rotting foundation in your house because it would cut into your budget for a new roof. You're just ignoring the fact that the entire house is going to collapse anyway.
That's a great way to put it. When you calculate the true cost of public health crises, the lost workforce productivity, the strain on government hospitals treating respiratory and cardiovascular illnesses, it vastly outweighs the cost of the FGD equipment.
That tension between rapid economic expansion and the immediate well-being of the population really defines how a state interacts with its citizens. And we see the friction of that rapid development clearly when we look at where citizens are most vulnerable today.
Absolutely.
Let's pull up the latest data from the National Crime Records Bureau, the NCRB Crime in India 2024 report.
So the headline figure being broadcasted everywhere is an overall 6% dip in registered crimes compared to the previous year.
Which sounds great, right?
It does, but a closer analysis of the data reveals that criminality isn't necessarily disappearing, it's just migrating.
Migrating to digital.
Exactly. There was a massive 17.9% jump in cybercrimes, crossing over 1 lakh reported cases, and revealingly, 72.6% of those cybercrimes were financially motivated fraud.
Wow. And while traditional hubs still struggle, Delhi, for instance, remains the crime capital among metros, topping the charts for crimes against women, senior citizens, accounting for like 30% of major city thefts, the sheer volume of the digital shift is staggering. Why is this migration happening so rapidly right now?
Well, it is the dark side of our digital public infrastructure push. As physical street crime becomes harder due to, CCTV proliferation and digital payments replacing cash, criminals pivot to where the targets are.
Following the money.
Always. India has brought hundreds of millions of people into the formal digital economy via UPI and smartphones in just a few years. But digital literacy and cybersecurity awareness have not kept pace with digital adoption.
That makes sense.
You have a massive population that is technologically connected, but highly vulnerable to social engineering and phishing.
When the system's meant to protect people, whether that's digital security infrastructure or physical law enforcement, fail to keep pace with reality, where does the citizen turn? They turn to the judiciary.
They do.
Which brings us to how our highest courts are fundamentally redefining the rights of the individual. So, what does this all mean? Let's examine a landmark Supreme Court ruling on the rights of Persons with Disabilities Act, or the RPWD Act.
Historically, the legal definition of an acid attack victim under the Act was rigidly interpreted, largely confined to those who suffered visible external disfigurement.
Right.
If you didn't have external scars, you struggled to get the mandated state welfare, medical cover, and rehabilitation.
But the Supreme Court has now ruled that victims who are forced to ingest acid individuals who suffer horrific, life-altering internal organ injuries but may have no visible external scars must also be classified as acid attack victims under the law.
And what's fascinating here is the constitutional philosophy behind this ruling. It is vital for our exam-focused listeners to grasp this. The petition successfully argued that excluding internal trauma victims violates Article 14 of the Constitution, which guarantees equality before the law.
Because the state was creating an arbitrary classification based on the method of the attack rather than the severity of the harm.
Exactly.
If two people are catastrophically disabled by the exact same chemical, it is fundamentally unconstitutional for the state to provide a safety net for one and completely abandon the other simply because the damage isn't visible to the naked eye.
Concurrently, we see a really powerful ruling from the Delhi High Court regarding the Medical Termination of Pregnancy, or MTP Act, that strikes a very similar philosophical chord.
Right. A medical board at RML Hospital had essentially washed its hands of a very complex case. They advised a woman to continue a 27-week pregnancy, even though multiple scans had confirmed severe, life-threatening fetal abnormalities.
The High Court was forced to intervene. They directed AIMS to form an entirely new medical board to evaluate the case. But more importantly, the court severely reprimanded the original doctors.
They go back.
No, they didn't. They stated the doctors had abdicated their statutory responsibilities and completely disregarded the profound physical and mental trauma of the mother.
When you look at both of these rulings together, expanding a Disability Act to recognize invisible trauma and reprimanding a hospital board to protect reproductive autonomy, a very clear picture emerges. The judiciary is acting as the ultimate backstop.
Yeah.
When rigid bureaucratic definitions or hesitant medical boards fail the individual, the courts are stepping in. They are using the Constitution as the living shield to prioritize human dignity and bodily autonomy.
Which actually leads us to a fascinating puzzle.
Oh.
If the Supreme Court is the ultimate guardian of the Constitution, what happens when it has to interpret the rules for the very machinery that elects the government?
That brings us to our final topic. The Supreme Court is currently hearing challenges regarding the appointment process for the Chief Election Commissioner and the election commissioners. The core of this issue is basically a brilliant case study in the separation of powers.
It really is. Let's lay out the facts for a second. In March 2023, a 5-judge Constitution bench ruled in the landmark case of Anup Baranwal versus Union of India. The court noted that Article 324 of the Constitution leaves the appointment of election commissioners to laws made by Parliament.
Right.
But because Parliament hadn't made a specific law yet, there was a legislative vacuum.
So the Supreme Court stepped into that vacuum. They ruled that until Parliament made a law, appointment should be made by a highly neutral panel: the Prime Minister, the Leader of the Opposition, and the Chief Justice of India.
However, a few months later, Parliament filled that vacuum. They passed the 2023 Act, which established a new selection committee.
And this is where the friction starts.
Exactly. This new committee comprised the Prime Minister, the Leader of the Opposition, and a Union Cabinet Minister, effectively removing the Chief Justice and placing a second executive branch member on the 3-person panel.
So the petitions challenging this new law basically argued that replacing the Chief Justice with a cabinet minister destroys the neutrality of the Election Commission, effectively keeping selection control firmly in the hands of the executive.
And this is the constitutional debate playing out right now. On one side, you have the argument that the 2023 law violates the basic structure of democracy by ignoring the Supreme Court's deep emphasis on institutional neutrality.
Okay, and on the other side?
On the other side, the argument is that the Supreme Court's ruling was explicitly meant to be a temporary stopgap. Once Parliament exercised its constitutional right to legislate the matter, the temporary judicial guidelines lost their binding force.
It asks the ultimate question: who guards the guards? Does Parliament have absolute authority to design the Electoral Committee, or must that design adhere to the spirit of neutrality defined by the court? It's a debate that is going to shape the operational mechanics of the world's largest democracy for decades to come.
It truly brings everything we've discussed today full circle. The strength of a nation isn't just one metric, it's the friction between all these moving parts.
Yeah. We started by exploring how India projects strength outward.
Yeah.
Using the lessons of Operation Sindoor to establish a subconventional deterrent and leveraging that security into aggressive trade renegotiations with ASEAN to stop our supply chains from being undercut.
And then we examined how that external posture relies entirely on the internal engine. We broke down the mechanics of compound semiconductor fabs, breaking global monopolies, the economic shock absorbers of ECLGS 5.0, keeping MSMEs afloat, and the severe, quantifiable human cost of fueling that engine with coal.
And finally, we looked at how the state manages the fallout. From the massive migration toward digital crime to the Supreme Court expanding the definitions of disability and bodily autonomy, right up to the battle over how we actually elect our leaders.
As you continue your studies, I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over. As India rapidly accelerates into a future defined by AI, digital public infrastructure, and domestic semiconductor fabs, ask yourself, will the daily reality of our future society be shaped more by the technological code we're writing in these new factories or by the constitutional interpretations currently being debated in our highest courts? Which framework ultimately holds the true power over the individual?
That is a phenomenal question. The technology might build the glass and steel of the nation, but it's the law that determines who gets to live inside and how strong the foundation really is. Thank you for joining us on this custom deep dive. Keep questioning the mechanisms behind the headlines, keep connecting the dots, and keep learning.